Hello everyone, my name is Eirik, welcome back to the studio. This is part 2 of a two-part series on casting a fragment from a larger mold in acrylic resin. With the resin casting done inside the mold, which we did in part 1, I'll let it sit for an hour or so to firm up. Once the resin turns from grey purple to brown, we know it's time to do the next step, which is going to be sanding the edge of the casting. If I have sharp stuff inside the casting, like a piece of fiberglass which sticks out of the resin coating or something like that, turning it into a murder weapon essentially, I will also sand that down to make sure that I don't cut myself when working with the casting. Now it's time to demold the casting, but wait, you might say. You forgot to close the mold and join the two halves together. What gives? Well, since this is a cast piece from a small portion of a mold and not a casting of the entire mold, it can make it very difficult to close the mold without the silicone flopping around, since there is nothing to hold most of the silicone in place like a casting inside the mold would normally do. Therefore, I will take the cast halves out of the silicone mold right here, and while they're out of the mold, join them together. Normally, I don't think this is the ideal way of doing things. You can do it this way for sure, but it's not the ideal way. For example, I've heard stories of someone with a mold which got distorted somehow, perhaps the silicone shrunk badly or something like that, which led to the two halves really not fitting well together. So instead of closing the mold, they demolded the two resin halves and put them together outside the mold. A resin half, which is sort of a bowl in a way, is a lot more flexible than when they're put together, which means you could potentially push and bend some part of it into place a bit better so that they line up a bit more. While not ideal, doing things this way is possible, and in our scenario here, I think it's the easiest and best option. The pieces came out well and it looks like they fit well together as well. I probably did a wee bit of sanding along the edges where the two halves meet to make sure the fit up was even more snug, or as snug as I could get it. We can't have two pieces, two halves of a bust not be joined into one bust of course, and this is the next objective on the agenda. I've used bungee cords, really small bungee cords, to hold the figure together here, and at the top of the head I've used brown packing tape. Partially to hold the two pieces together, but also partially to prevent leakage. One problem that can happen here is that the resin can leak out of the seam and create a bit of a mess, flowing and running all over our sculpture. Hopefully our seam is tight enough to keep this from happening, and the tape might help a bit as well. Thick resin is brushed into the seam between the two halves from the inside. Keeping the resin mixture thicker here is helpful since it will keep it from running through the seam too much and leaking out everywhere and all over our cast. If the resin mix is a little thicker, we can fill the seam without any leaks or without too many leaks. Fiberglass is then laid across the seam and the two halves are locked together. Having fiberglass across the seam really makes sure that these two halves never can come apart without an excessive amount of force. A couple of pieces of fiberglass are used since the more of the seam that is covered with fiberglass the better. If we need to retouch the seam from the outside of the casting after this procedure, it's much easier to do so if there is something behind the little opening in the seam, like a piece of fiberglass, as opposed to there simply being a hole there which the resin is going to want to fall into. We can certainly still fix a hole, but it takes more time and needs to happen gradually, since the resin can't cover larger gaps without collapsing and falling into the casting. Finally, just like when working with the fiberglass inside the casting, I'm going to take a very thin mix of resin and brush it over the fiberglass to really lock it in place from above. This ensures the fiberglass really can't go anywhere and covers all the gaps between the fiberglass layer and the resin below it. This makes for a more solid casting and a stronger casting. Any leaks that occur, I try to take care of now. If I had any major leaks, I would have used clay to seal them up, but I didn't, and that was good. To make sure the liquid resin that's inside the casting right now doesn't pool anywhere in the back or in the front, I set the sculpture upright against some studio equipment. To mount the casting, I've prepared an aluminum armature wire that I've bent to fit inside the sculpture. The reason we're using this here is because I need this sculpture to be poseable once mounted, so that I can get it into the position I want to sculpt a larger sculpture in. Aluminum armature wire is flexible, so once mounted to a board here, I'm going to be able to bend the wire and change the pose of the bust and the direction of the portrait's gaze without much effort. I want to attach the wire well inside the sculpture so it doesn't break off during the posing. Mounting it in one place or at one point is going to focus the stresses, so therefore I'm going to mount it in multiple places inside the casting, creating what's hopefully a really strong bond. First, I drape a piece of fiberglass wet with resin over the top of the wire and insert it into the top of the head. The pressure from me pushing the wire into the head should be enough to make sure that the fiberglass contacts the top of the head and therefore locks the wire in place inside the top of the head. I bent the wire already to allow for good connection into one shoulder of the bust. I use fiberglass to cover the wire and make sure the fiberglass makes contact with the surface of the casting. The inside surface of the casting, that is, of course, so that the wire and the casting gets bonded together. To get the fiberglass to wrap around the wire and get down onto the surface of the casting, I use a spatula and sometimes the end of a brush. Whatever I can use to essentially get the job done that's handy and close by is what I'll use. I'll also use the excess resin to spread it around and over the fiberglass, making sure that we don't end up with dry fiber not sticking to the inside of the casting here is very important, of course. Using a little extra resin when weight isn't an issue, like it won't be here since the piece is so small, is okay and will provide some extra strength. We don't need the cast to be super strong, of course, but we do need the connection between wire and casting to be strong and secure. With the wire firmly stuck inside our casting, we're ready for the final step, which is giving ourselves something to mount the casting to. Currently, the thin aluminum wire is not going to want to stand on its own, of course. We could drill a hole in a wooden board, but since the wire is square, this makes it potentially wobbly and not so secure. Instead, we'll use plumber's piping and create a vertical solid pipe armature, which we can then use hose clamps to temporarily attach our sculpture to. I'll use 2 hose clamps because that will keep the bust from pivoting on one connection point, of course. And hose clamps. Hose clamps are an underrated part of the sculptor's arsenal of tools. Definitely get your hands on some hose clamps. Later, once this casting has served its purpose as reference for a larger head study, I can redo how it's attached to the base and create a more permanent setup, better suited for display purposes. This setup, however, is very flexible and can be mounted at different heights if I need to change that, and it can be posed in an almost infinite variety of poses thanks to the flexible armature wire, all features which I'd like to have present right now. Final thing to do here is to pose the bust, of course. Once we've done that, the figure is done and ready to be used as reference. Keep in mind that casting small fragments from your molds of larger sculptures can also be a good idea for creating new compositions and wall-mounted pieces which can look really cool. One of the great benefits we have as sculptors is exactly this. Since we make molds of our pieces, we can repurpose parts of them for other pieces, or even create new pieces out of the fragments cast from the molds of larger works. In the future, I'll make a tutorial for how to take a part of your larger piece and make it into a display piece that can be wall mounted. This is certainly a good business idea as well, as most people can fit stuff on their walls, but not always fit a sculpture meant to be seen in the round into their home. That's it for today's video. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you learned a thing or two that you can take with you into your own practice. Until next time, stay creative.